Well, hello, folks, and thanks for tuning in for another week. You know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. This is the Forums edition. You know we do the Chats edition once a week where we talk to a poker celebrity, someone from the world of poker. Then we have the Forums edition where we take a post or a hand from the Rec Poker Forums and talk about it here on the air. We're kind of going to mash those together tonight. I'm excited. We've got Sky Matsuhashi in the house. We're going to be talking some strategy with Sky. And of course, we are going to talk to our Wrecking Crew members because you can't do anything here at Rec Poker without interacting with some of the movers and shakers, the magic makers behind the curtain here at Rec.Poker. It's the Wrecking Crew. I'm your host, Jim Reed, Bluffsterini in the home game, and Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. But I am just one of the group. It takes a whole village to do what we do here. And if you want to find out more about me or the other members of the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew. But listen up, you're going to meet two of them here tonight.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I'm PetVet_33. PetVet33 on the home game.
And I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman50 just about everywhere.
And of course, also, even though most of what we do here is free at Rec Poker, we're a largely volunteer-based organization, we do have a fantastic premium membership, and that's where a lot of our members show their support, and that's where they kind of unlock the most valuable training material, the most fun social events, discounts on other training sites. There's a lot of great reasons to go try Rec Poker Premium, and if you use the code Rec Poker at checkout, you get your first month for only $5. One of the perks is coming here on the Forums edition of the podcast, and regular listeners will know Eric Anderson already. But Eric, thanks for coming and joining us on the show. Why don't you tell Rec Poker Nation where they can find you?
Hi, everybody. I'm E. Anderson85 and at recpoker.com and in the home game.
And we always want to throw a .com on there, but it's actually just rec.poker. It's amazing. They let us get away with it. That's okay. Yeah. But I swear, I still want to put a .com on there, just like make it official. But no, they let us have it. So what can you do? We're just lucky punks. I don't know if I've already thanked the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino because they're our fantastic sponsor and we depend on their support. And now that I've thanked pretty much everyone other than Sky himself, Sky Matsuhashi, thanks so much for coming back on the Rec Poker Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's great to be here with everybody.
Well, I know here at Rec Poker, every month we have a different theme of the month. And I know at the Poker Forge, you go through different themes as well, and you're often tailoring your videos and you know, different programs around basic themes. Because I know you're a great proponent of active study and of really having a focus to what you're doing. And that's why I think you're one of the best people for recreational players to work with, because you really give them a good roadmap. You're a great teacher, and you make it easy for them to come along. You've talked about a couple in advance that you and I are going to be looking at here. And the first one's one of my favorites, Sky, the bread and butter spots. So why don't you just tell, if our audience doesn't already know, tell us a little bit about bread and butter spots and why they're so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, bread and butter is a term that I learned from Tommy Angelo in his book, Elements of Poker, one of the best, if not the best poker book of all time. And it's a spot that he talked about. He said this is where his bread gets buttered when he is in position as the pre-flop raiser against one or two other players. And you can kind of imagine why that's such a valuable spot, right? In position means on the flop, turn, and river, you get to act after your opponent. So you have a little extra time to think, but you also get to see what they do, whether they donk bet into you, whether they check. You get to, if you're playing online, you get to look at their stats and gauge what kind of player they are. And then you make their play, and they have to kind of make their play knowing that you have position, flop, turn, and river. The other aspect of that bread and butter that made it so powerful is you are the pre-flop raiser. You have pocket aces, kings, queens, ace, king in your range, whereas sometimes players call with those strongest hands. But when they call, most players really limit their range. And they're calling out of the blinds, for example. You've seen players all the time defending with Jack 6 suited, 10-7 suited, things like that. Well, your ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, ace 10, all your big pocket pairs, you're crushing them. So you have a range advantage over them. Those two things, the positional advantage and the range advantage, that's what makes bread and butter such a profitable spot. Because when you see bet, when they check to you on the flop, they're not sure if you have a really strong overpair or you're just totally bluffing. And a lot of players just check fold to those hands or in those situations. And So it's so much easier to get people to fold when you have position and a stronger range, but it's also pretty easy to get value. You can tailor your bet size based on what you think your opponent can call with, and you can potentially get more value because you're in position with that stronger range when you flop something good.
And I'll, if anyone on the panel here wants to ask any questions of Sky, I know I've got a couple, so I'll dive in here a little bit and feel free to jump in at any time. So this does feel like the kind of thing where a lot of the value is actually expressed post-flop when you get to take advantage of your range advantage and your positional advantage. But you really have to be thinking about it pre-flop. It really has to be on your mind the entire time. And so would you say that you are, and this, correct me or clarify for me, Sky, this applies whether you're the open raiser and you get called from the blinds, or if someone opens in front of you and you 3-bet and get called, it would still be a bread and butter spot, right?
Yes, as long as you were the last pre-flop raiser and you have that post-flop position, bread and butter.
Okay, fantastic.
Mhm.
So it feels like there are some ways that you can create the situation pretty frequently. One of them would be if it folds to you choosing to open raise instead of limping, as an example. That's probably the most common. When I look at database reviews for Rec Poker members, I always look at facing pre-flop action is one of the tables that you can look at there. And by far, the circumstance that players encounter the most frequently is an unopened pot. So the best way that you can kind of create a bread and butter spot is just by open raising. And is that something that so I guess what I'm asking is there room for open limping at all in a scenario like this? Are you going to be trying to sort of like limp and maybe back raise, or is that just getting a little too sophisticated or a little too was the fancy play syndrome for what we're
Yeah, a little bit of
here?
FPS, fancy play syndrome right there. Generally, what I teach my students is no open limping, no over limping, really. The only kind of time you can over limp after somebody else limps is when you're in the small blind and it's only costs a half more big blind and you don't think the big blind is going to raise over your limp. That's a key thing. In general, when you're striving, when you're hunting for bread and butter, you want to be just the open raiser or the raising, the ISO raiser. Somebody limps and you come over the top of them. Those are the two most common situations. The third, what you had already mentioned, is 3-betting. And generally, when you limp, you're going to be facing somebody's ISO raise, or it's going to be limped around by other players. You might go 5-way to the pot in the limped, 5-way to the flop in a limped pot. Not really, not at all a bread and butter spot. You know, that's kind of like playing bingo poker. You're trying to just hit something on the flop in those kinds of situations. You're better off just being the aggressor as much as possible, open raising and 3-betting, as opposed to limping and calling. Oh, and
Rob
one of the
Washington?
things too.
Oh, yep.
So you asked about, pre-flop and everything. Two things. When you open raise, you often want to just steal the pot, or you're hoping that one of the blinds is the only caller. So they naturally get into a bread and butter spot, right? But always be on the lookout before you open raise in the under the gun or in the MP. Look at the players in the cutoff and the button. Engage whether or not they like to 3-bet. Are you potentially going to face a 3-bet from these players? Or are they going to call a lot? And maybe they'll call, the blinds will defend. Now you're multi-way. That's not the end of the world. You were the pre-flop raiser, but it's a multi-way pot, a little bit more landmines you have to dodge, things you have to consider, which makes it slightly more difficult to bluff and maybe less likely to get value as opposed to those bread and butter situations against just one or maybe two other players.
That's a great point. Rob, do you have something?
Well, I was just going to talk about when you're in that bread and butter situation. Last month or so, we've been talking about c-betting. And we talk about c-betting sizes based on the flop texture. And so I'm curious how you structure your when you c-bet, when you don't c-bet, and how much you c-bet based on the flop texture.
The flop texture does matter. Definitely. The harder so most of the time when you're c-betting, you're bluffing because you don't have an overpair. You didn't flop a top pair hand. You have ace queen on a 10 high board, that kind of thing. Most of the time you're bluffing. So when I look at flop texture, I really like to bluff on hard to hit boards, the 10-7 deuce rainbow kind of board where there's not a lot of good draws, right? the drier the board, the less I will bet. Most of the time, like the lowest I'll go is 50%. But occasionally, if I know my opponent and if I know he's capable of folding and it's a hard to hit board, I might just go 33% or even 25% pot, depending on what I think. Like if he's going to give me what I want, if he's going to fold most of his range versus 25%, why risk 50? Why risk 60%? So the drier the board, I'd be willing to bet lower, but generally I bet half pot at the minimum. And then I'll go up to 2/3 or 3/4 pot for my bluffs, depending on if I think it will require more to get that player to fold, if I think they're a little bit more sticky. And speaking of players, if I'm in a bread and butter spot and I know my opponent hates folding, his fold to C bet is only 10%, and it's a wet board, I'm probably not going to bluff. But what I'll do instead is I'll bet big for value. I'll bet 3/4, 85% pot, because he can't fold, but I have something really strong. I'm going to get as much value as I can.
Rob?
And I'm going to say, to follow up, I believe you are playing mostly cash games.
Yes.
And what we generally talk about here is a lot of tournament play. So I think the bet sizing are probably a little different in tournaments than they would be in cash games, where you're always at least 100 big blinds deep.
Yep, exactly. I play tournaments sometimes, but that's not anywhere, like that's not what I focus on as a coach, right? I play them sometimes, I goof around on them, but I haven't studied tournament strategy like I've studied cash games. I don't play nearly as many tournaments as cash. So yeah, but I think all the strategies that I discuss in cash games, they're applicable and useful in tournaments, especially when you're deeper at the start of the tournament before everyone's down to 20 to 30 big blinds.
So Sky, when you create a bread and butter spot pre-flop, then what ends up happening post-flop is you're playing with an uncapped range, you're in position, and this, as you kind of mentioned earlier, this gives you the opportunity to bluff effectively and also to value bet effectively. I think if people wanted to, people hear this stuff, but I don't think they really appreciate it until they open up Poker Tracker and like filter for these different scenarios. If you're listening at home and you have Poker Tracker, Sky, I'm just going to ask you to kind of, is there a filter set or a report that they can create where they can compare the scenarios where they are in the bread and butter situations versus the scenarios where someone else is in the bread and butter situations, and see how profitable and not profitable those are?
Yeah, absolutely. The easiest way to do it is in Poker Tracker 4, you would filter for 2-bet pre-flop. That means you made the first raise. So maybe somebody limped and you raised, or you open raised. 2-bet pre-flop. The second filter would be did not call a 3-bet, because if you're calling a 3-bet, you're automatically not going to be in a bread and butter spot, even if you're in position, right? So you made the 2-bet, you did not call the 3-bet, you're in position on the flop, and the flop has only 2 or 3 players. That's your standard bread and butter 2-bet pot filter. 4 aspects to that one. You could do the same thing for 3-betting. 3-bet pre-flop, did not call a 4-bet, in position 2 or 3 players. So both of those will give you just a really good look at what your profitability is in those situations. And you can flip this kind of, right? You can say, you can look at non-bread and butter spots for yourself. You called the 2-bet, you're out of position on the flop. Just filter for those 2 things and then compare and contrast. Oh my gosh, bread and butter, I'm positive 125 big blinds per 100 hands. Non-bread and butter, I'm negative 42. Or whatever that win rate is, right? And you'll soon realize that those bread and butter spots are your most profitable situations. Plus, if you just think about it and you think about your most difficult spots to be in, it's quite often when you're calling out of the blinds, or maybe you open raise and then called a 3-bet from the button. You're out of position, you have the weaker range, and now you just have to check, and it's really difficult to gauge what to do when you're in those non-bread and butter spots.
Yeah, and I think if people would be surprised if they ran some filters in their own Poker Tracker program at home, just for are they the player making the last aggressive action? Are they the player in position? It almost seems like there's a natural tendency to make money when you're in those conditions, and to lose money when someone else is under those conditions, and you're the one feeling the pressure, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the great things too. One of the great things too about running these filters and going through your database and realizing that bread and butter is more profitable it kind of, a lot of players, they have a hard time folding their blinds. I put out the small blind. He keeps raising me. I have to defend, right? But when you realize that continuing to defend with way too many hands out of position is just costing you money, it makes it easier to fold from that point forward, right? And when you start to realize that it's easy to fold because you know that's an unprofitable situation, that kind of thinking works its way post flop too. Oh, I flopped the under gut shot without a backdoor draw, but there's 2 spades on the board. My opponent bet. Should I really check call this right here? I'm going to be facing another bet once I check on the turn and I don't hit my hand, right? Like, so that thinking of or the ability to fold when you know it's an ugly spot, when you know you're putting yourself in a bad situation, that extends beyond pre-flop 2 and flop turn in a river.
Yeah, I like that. Someone once described completing the small blind as getting a discount on something you'd never want to purchase in the first place.
That's
so
good.
that makes sense. Like, yeah, it's a great deal on a situation you don't want to find yourself in. So now, so my last question, that's actually a great takeoff point for my last question, which is that when you're in late position, it feels like you can put yourself in bread and butter spots pretty easily. If it folds to you, you can open. If someone opens in front of you, you can 3-bet. And you can also avoid being in, I don't know, do you have a term for the opposite of a bread and butter spot? What would that be? Like
I just call it
sand and
non-bread and
gravel
butter.
spot? Yeah, okay.
I mean, I could come up. I'm not creative enough to come up with something great. I just non-bread and butter.
So you can avoid not being a better bread and butter spot by 3-betting if someone opens in front of you instead of calling, or by folding. When you're out of position in the blinds, even if you 3-bet, you're still not going to be in position post flop very often. So it feels like it's hard to be in a bread and butter spot in the blinds. Is that roughly correct? Is it, it's mostly the way to avoid being in someone else's bread and butter spot is going to be by fold.
Absolutely, out of the blinds. In the small blind, you can never be in a bread and butter spot. And then in the big blind, you can, if it folds to the small blind and he limps or is the first raiser, then it can be bread and butter. If you decide to 3-bet at that point or raise over his limp.
And so I guess you can choose to 3-bet out of the blinds more frequently to sort of prevent your opponent from being in a bread and butter spot. Because if they call your 3-bet, even though they're in position, they haven't fulfilled the other requirements of so you're kind of, because I think I want to just talk about the defense of it a little bit, because I really want to reinforce, Sky's put this set of circumstances together that are very powerful when they all work together. Being in position, being against few opponents, having an uncapped range, plus people fold all the time pre-flop. Like, that's one of the nice things we haven't mentioned here is setting up a bread and butter spot. Sometimes you just win the pot right there, right?
That's right. Yep.
So playing defense and kind of avoiding situations where someone else is in a bread and butter spot against you, Sky, a lot of that has to just be folding, and then maybe some sort of fight, defensive 3-betting. Is that about right?
That is about right. Yeah. But sometimes the situation warrants itself. It warrants, how do I say it? It's worthy of going into a non-bread and butter spot by calling out of the blinds. And really, like, sometimes you might have the perfect hand. You've got pocket fives. He's a tight aggressive player. He only raised it 2 big blinds. You can call 1 big blind out of the big blind to hit your set. I mean, things like that are absolutely worthy of calling, right? But before you make any play that is going to put you in non-bread and butter, defending that out of the small blind, defending out of the big blind, have a plan for the flop. Like, know who the open raiser is. Is he tight aggressive? Does he c-bet a lot? Is he a loose aggressive spewy player? Is he going to barrel flop turn in river? Does he check the flop a lot so I can bet the turn into him? Like, have a plan when you're going to call. You're not going to be in bread or butter. Plan on not hitting the flop, so know how to steal it from him before you make that non-bread and butter pre-flop call.
Yep, I love it. Well, I think that's all the questions I had prepared. So I've got good news for our listeners here. If you're enjoying this kind of conversation, Sky's actually got a sale going on right now where you can get a great discount on membership at the Poker Forge. So Sky, you've been running the Poker Forge for quite a while here. It's the training site that kind of took off from Smart Poker Study. Tell our audience a little bit about the kind of work that you do there and what kind of discount they can get on this great sale this week.
Yeah, at the Poker Forge, I have 9 masterclass courses which teach you all you need to know to be profitable in the micro stakes online poker cash games. So Rob earlier said tournaments. The stuff I teach will help you in tournaments. It will help you exploit your opponents, make reads, hand read, utilize HUD statistics, play bread and butter, avoid non-profitable spots, all that kind of stuff. But really, I focus on those cash games, micro stakes, and that's where my, I guess, my expertise lies in turning losing players into profitable players, and then slightly profitable into very profitable players. So if that sounds like you need some help at the micro stakes, that's the place to go. And right now, like you had said, I got 30% off the monthly or the annual Poker Forge membership right now. And I guess there's a link in an
I'll put
affiliate
a
link in the
link
show
in
notes
the-
page, right?
Yeah, that's right. And folks, anytime you're shopping at the Poker Forge, if you use the code RecPoker at checkout, it just lets Sky know that we sent you there, which is a great way to support both of our organizations. And yes, I will put the link in the show notes there so folks can connect with you directly. And speaking of connecting with you directly, Sky, you're at Smart Poker Study on Twitter. Where else do you like folks to connect with you? And what's the best way
Twitter
to
and
get in touch?
YouTube. That's it.
Yep.
At Smart Poker Study on both of those. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Well, then I really want to thank Sky Matsuhashi, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, Eric Anderson, Rob Washam, and Kim Kilroy. And of course, you, the audience, our listeners. We wouldn't do it without you, so thanks for all your support, and we'll see you next week. All right, good night.